All right. Well, it is 12:02, so I think we will get rolling here. We'll let some folks come in as they join the waiting room as well. So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second session of our Human Resources Roundtable series. This session is titled "Onboarding and Culture" with Kimala Daniels, founder and principal consultant of Infinite Ubora Consulting. My name is Tom Banky, and I am the Operations and Outreach Manager at WISCAP, so thank you for joining. Onboarding is more than a checklist. It's the first true imprint of your organization's culture. And yet, most new hires don't experience it that way. In fact, only 12% of employees experience it that way. They strongly agree that their organization does in fact, only 12% of employees strongly agree that their organization does a great job onboarding, according to a Gallup poll. For nonprofits where resources are tight and roles are broad, thoughtful onboarding can be the difference between long-term engagement and early turnover. In this session, we'll explore how to transform onboarding into a culture-building opportunity, one that creates clarity, connection, and trust from the start. Together, we will cover a practical framework for strategic onboarding, even in lean teams, ways to align onboarding with your mission, values, and equity goals, simple, no-cost ways to build culture on purpose, metrics you can use to track that impact, and how AI can help you help lighten the lift. Now a little bit more about our speaker. Kimala Daniels is a trusted strategic advisor, seasoned HR executive, and leadership coach with over 25 years of experience helping organizations succeed at the intersection of people, performance, and purpose. As founder and principal consultant of Infinite Ubora Consulting, Ubora means excellence in Swahili, Kimala partners with nonprofits, schools, corporations, and boards to align culture, leadership, and operations with vision. She is known for her clarity, integrity, and pragmatic approach. She specializes in building high-performing teams, supporting leadership transitions, and guiding organizations through growth and change. Note, this is the second session of our Human Resources Roundtable. These hour-long sessions will take place monthly at noon, so we have another one coming up in December and January. And the topics that will be covered in those sessions will be, in December, we'll talk about compensation and benefits. And then in January, we're going to talk about policies and procedures. Now, before I turn it over to Kimala, I wanted to pass along some housekeeping notes. So please be courteous to all attendees and remain on mute during the presentation unless you're asked to ask a question, which we do have a few reflection points during today's presentation. We recommend that you use speaker view during the presentation. Once again, if you do have a question, we please ask that you utilize the chat function. Sabrina and I will be monitoring that throughout the presentation and address them as time allows during natural breaks during our time together. So also following this presentation, you'll receive a follow-up email with links to access the presentation materials and a survey link to leave your comments about the session. So at this point, my part is over, so I'm going to hand it over to Kimala. So Kimala, take it away.
Thank you, Tom. I'll share my screen for everyone. Okay, that was a great introduction. As Tom said, I'm Kimala Daniels. I'm Kimala, not Kamala, Kamula. Sometimes people call me Patricia. It's Kimala. And I will answer to, if you can't remember that, Kim. But I look forward to this opportunity to spend the next several minutes with you to talk about building culture through strategic onboarding. And as Tom alluded to in the opening, onboarding isn't what a lot of organizations still do, which is new employee orientation. So the thought that the new employee shows up on day one, there's this pile of paperwork that needs to be completed, which is usually HR paperwork to get them started, and then they're shuffled off to their workstation, they get started. That is not onboarding. Onboarding is more about a strategic plan around being intentional about the new employee's first day at the organization and then every day subsequent from that new day. It is your opportunity to build a mission aligned relationship with your new employee and also to create an atmosphere where they understand what their work does, the work that they do contributes to the overall mission of the organization. So Tom already shared a little bit about me, so I won't spend any time on that, but I'll jump right into what we will cover today. So we'll talk about how onboarding shapes culture and retention. A lot of times, organizations are so focused on getting that new employee in the door and getting them started that they're not thinking long term around how it aligns with the culture and how do you retain them, especially in today's environment where there's a lot of turnover. We'll cover 5 elements for effective onboarding. I think they're natural elements that you should consider when you're onboarding someone, but you'd be amazed at how some organizations kind of forget some of these. We'll also talk about leader time commitment. So it does take time for leaders to invest thoughtfully into onboarding, but we'll talk about how that is an additional time that you'll spend. It's reshaping or refocusing the time that you're already spending with your new hires. And then you'll find this in all of my presentations, I'll talk about how to do this well with limited resources, and that could be either budget and or people. We'll also discuss designing culture with intention. You may hear a phrase that you've never heard before, which is cultural drift. We'll talk about what that is and how to be intentional about not having that occur in your organization, as well as measuring what matters. So anything that we do should be measured. There's this analogy that we measure what's most important. So we'll talk about how to do that. And then I do want to share with all of you practical tools that you can put in place right away, even next Monday. So we'll cover those. And then also following this presentation, I'll send a email out with a link to a drive where you can access those tools. So before we get started in the presentation, I'd like to share a real transformation story with you because I think it drives home how when you have intention, you're thoughtful about the work that you do regarding new hires and onboarding, that it can yield very impactful results. So several years ago, I was working with an organization in Wisconsin, in Sauk County, actually, that did not have a more formal strategic onboarding process. What they had was a first day orientation. So new hires showed up, they completed their paperwork, their I-9s, their W-4 information, etc. They may even have been given, they were given actually their job description. And then they were taken to their new department, and the rest was left to them to figure out. However, fast forward with intention, day one, 3 years later, the organization applied for and they were awarded the Gallup Exceptional Workplace Award. And how did they do this? They did this with intentional onboarding. So, what changed in those 2 years? They focused on pre boarding, which is what happens before day one. They sent welcome emails to their new employees. They had pre-boarding calls, a 15-minute call from the leader to the employee to talk about their first day. They sent the new employee mission impact information. So mission, vision, values, any other items that they could send to the employee ahead of time. And I think another thing that was really important that they did at the time was they assigned onboarding buddies. So someone at the organization that the new hire could connect with and could walk along with them on their new journey. So I want to reiterate that they won the Gallup Exceptional Workplace Award not once, but twice. It also led to clarity around roles, more connection around mission, and they did this with the same budget. the same staff size. And by the way, they didn't have a large HR department. They had one HR individual. They were just more intentional about how they spent their time over the first 30 days. So what does the research say about onboarding? And so when you look at onboarding, Gallup does annual survey every year that looks at employee satisfaction or employee engagement. They look at multiple things, but that data tells us that only 12% of new hires believe that their onboarding experience with their new organization was a great experience. So that means only 1 in 8 of new hires believe that their onboarding was a good onboarding process. And so that left 88% of employees that didn't feel like they had a great experience. And I think that's an opportunity for organizations to focus on that will help with retention and connecting the new employee with the organization. What they also found was that with intentional onboarding that was done really well, that new employees were 2.6 times more likely to be satisfied with their organization. And ultimately, through the research that Brandon Hall Group did, there was a correlation between onboarding, satisfaction, and long-term retention. So those employees who had a great onboarding experience are more likely to stay with their organization for 3 or more years. So before we get into the actual framework, let's do a little reality check. So you finally hired the perfect person. You've been posting for the role for months. You've interviewed several candidates. They've accepted the role, and then the first day arrives. So what typically happens with many organizations, the new employee's there, they complete their paperwork, but the laptop isn't ready. There's been technology delays. IT department says there'll be a couple more days before it's ready. The supervisor is generally drowning in meetings. They're in back-to-back meetings all day. They may have 15 minutes, possibly an hour to spend with the new hire, but then they leave them with someone else on the team. So there's limited communication. And then the first week that they're there becomes just a patchwork of reactive scheduling. So introducing, walking them through the organization. This is so and so. They work on this program. You'll figure out what they do along the way. And they're also given their job description, expected to read their job description, and also know exactly how they're going to contribute. And then the thing that's left to be figured out also is the critical relationship building. So as they're going through this patchwork of their first week, they basically get a poor first impression, almost like the organization wasn't prepared. And there was a little bit of a bait and switch in relationship to the recruiting process when when the organization talked about what happens at the organization, how they care about employees. They do really important work, but on their first day, there's a disconnect there. But I'm sure none of this happens at any of your organizations. So let's get a little more data for you to support this. The real cost of poor onboarding. So your people are leaving before they reach their full potential, and most non-for-profit organizations, and I will say other for-profit organizations, aren't adequately prepared for the leadership transition, right? Oops, excuse me. Sorry about that. So when we think about the cost of turnover, most people really don't consider the entire cost. So when a person turns over an organization, $20 to $50,000 are generally spent per employee on turnover costs. Now you might think that's a lot. So 20,000 is generally for that entry level employee, and then the higher up in the organization, it could be a senior leader, executive director. it could be up to $50,000 a cost. That includes your recruiting cost, it includes the training cost, it includes lost productivity, it includes low morale with the staff that are left that have to consume or pick up the workload. And if you think about an entry level role or a role with the organization that makes about $45,000 a year, you're basically spending the entire salary cost for that role in turnover costs. So, how long does it generally take to replace someone when they leave? It generally takes 6 to 9 months to replace that person. And during that time, you have lost productivity. You also have lost institutional knowledge as well. So at this point, you're probably wondering, we barely have time to breathe. How can we add intentional onboarding to our plates? And so, what I would say here is you're already spending time. So, the general amount of time spent regarding strategic onboarding is anywhere from 15 to 20 hours spread over the first 90 days of a new employee. Now, that seems like a lot, but when you think about how you're already spending that time, you're spending it on re explaining the same things multiple times because there wasn't clarity around the role and responsibilities. You're spending that time managing confusion and mistakes within the first 90 days. And you're also spending that time, if that employee leaves, recruiting and training a replacement within 6 months. I think the other thing that's important to remember around lack of an intentional onboarding strategy, especially for non-for-profits, is there can be a lot of confusion and role ambiguity in non-for-profits because you're lean. And so generally staff wear multiple hats. And so to this extent, you can be intentional about creating clarity around the role and how that role connects to the mission, the more productivity that the new hire will have, the better that the overall team and morale of the organization and ultimately the delivery of your mission to your clients will be better. So let's take a moment and do a quick reflection. Before we jump into the framework, I would like to know from the people on the call, what's your biggest onboarding challenge right now? If you could just drop that in the chat for me. And it's okay if you want to list more than one. These are the things that keep you from doing onboarding the way you'd like to do it. Maybe it's time, lack of time. Maybe it's that you don't have a formal process. Or it could be that the team is too small, or maybe you don't have leadership buy-in in how to spend the time. Whatever it is, drop it in the chat. And Sabrina, I'd like to ask you to share, since I don't have a view of the chat, if you can share what are some of the biggest onboarding challenges the group is.
Yeah, we have consistency from supervisor to supervisor, consistency across different programs, hiring leader involvement and engagement, including major plans, stakeholder in the initial process, time, working with supervisors to develop an on-job onboarding plan, not done strategically, locations and time. Seems like time is a big one, as staff
Mhm.
are spread out into different offices in different counties. And that seems to be about it.
Yeah, there does seem to be a theme around time. Time and resources is what I hear a lot when I work with organizations, but I would say all are really common challenges, especially when I think I heard team spread across multiple locations, and you may be even dealing with some that are in the office as well as working from home, so hybrid. So that changes the entire onboarding process more around delivery, how you deliver it, not around building an intentional strategic process. So, as I said, these are all common, and the framework we're about to go through addresses all of these. It doesn't require a lot of time. It does require it, and it doesn't require a big formal process. But what makes the case is it does require intention. So keep your specific challenges in mind as we go through. Let's dive into the framework. So here's the strategic onboarding framework. There's 5 elements to the framework. First, there's the purposeful pre-boarding. Kind of alluded to this at the beginning of the presentation. So this is exactly how it sounds. It's doing some work. It's front loading the onboarding process with connection before the first day for the new employee. And then there's the cultural connection. And this is really important for non-for-profits, is how do you quickly get your new hire connected to your mission and your values so they know that the work that they're doing is meaningful and how it connects with the mission. And then there's role clarity. This is the number one thing that if it's not done well around role clarity, it creates ambiguity, uncertainty around their role in the organization and the importance of their work. And it also ultimately leads to the question of whether or not they made the right decision to sign on with your organization. And then there's the support system. So, as we all know, as humans, we need support. Well, new hires definitely need support when they start with a new organization. It could be scary, it could be overwhelming, and trying to learn the nuances of any new organization, but especially a mission driven organization that is lean, needs to have the employee be supported. And then last but not least is equity, belonging, and accessibility. So how do you ensure that equity and belonging and accessibility is woven throughout their entire experience, starting with their first day? So how do you create an onboarding experience that takes into account their learning style, their communication style, etc.? So let's jump into these in a little more detail. So pre-boarding, we talked about this is what happens before they walk in the door of your organization. You send them a welcome email from the executive director or the CEO. Uh, it's also, I mean, it can also come from the leader, but I find that through the or the recruiting process, new hires don't always have an opportunity to connect with the executive director or the CEO unless they're direct leader. So having either one of them, depending on what you have in your organization, send a welcome email goes a long way for establishing a relationship. If this isn't something that can happen in your organization, by all means, the leader should be sending the welcome email. And it should have that overall feeling of excitement that they're coming to the organization and excitement about the contribution that they're going to be sharing through their role. You should also give them their first week schedule. So there's a lot of, I don't know if you all remember when you just signed on for a new role and you're preparing, you have so many questions about what's going to happen, and there can be some curiosity along with some healthy anxiety and a little worry, depending the type of person you are. When you provide an overview of their first week schedule, what they can anticipate, it really helps them settle into okay, this is what my first week's going to look like. They care about the experience that they're going to be providing me, and I know what I'm going to be doing, and I can prepare for it. This is also a great opportunity to share with them the mission work, the mission information that you have. So that's the mission, the vision, the values. I also encourage non-for-profits to share your most recent annual report because that gets right to the nuts and bolts of what your organization does and the impact that you've had, and most likely will continue to have. It also kind of makes them proud to sign on when they see the impact. And then the role clarity. So provide, once they start with the organization, on day one, they need to know, what does success look like for them? Not just give them their job description, but what does success look like at 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days? And I just want to say, I'll talk a lot about the first 90 days. I don't want to imply that after 90 days, everyone's fully ready, and all your onboarding work should stop. The one-on-one time that you spend with them and the amount of time that you spend with them will start to decrease after 90 days because they should ramp up and be fully proficient in their roles. But you still should spend time with them even after the 90 days. But for this session today, we'll talk about the 90 days because that's the most important time. So during that role clarity, it's also important to share with them, who should they go to for their questions. This is not their manager. It could be their manager, but this is also the expand, who they can go to for any questions, as well as what's often overlooked is new employees have great ideas. Because they're new to the organization, they have a new lens at how they're looking at things. You need to create a space and a connection point for them so they can share what their new ideas are without feeling intimidated about doing that. This is also important to drive home through role clarity how their work is connected to the mission. And this is not just related to non-for-profits. This is every organization that I work with. Employees want to know that their work is purposeful, that what they're showing up to do every day is meaningful. I think it's easier to do that for non-for-profits. So don't miss this opportunity to really drive home clarity around how their work matters. And then the third element is culture connection. And so I'll talk more about the culture connection and how it aligns with onboarding. But, oftentimes with organizations, there's, the values and different things about the culture are stated either in statements or wall hangings or things like that. But it's really helpful for the new employee to actually hear values in action or be able to see values in action. So stories from your clients, from the community, stories from other departments, even your team, other team members about the values of the organization and how they play out in relationship to serving your community. And then the next element is the support system. So weekly one-on-ones with the new employee. This is a leadership one-on-ones with them. It should be around 45 minutes to an hour. And I'll talk more about what this looks like in a subsequent slide. One-on-ones for the first month and then bi-weekly one-on-ones in the subsequent months. This is also where you should assign a peer buddy. So this isn't the manager. It is someone who's been with the organization a little while. You want to pick someone who has a great attitude, about the organization. They know how all the pieces connect. Assign them a peer buddy. This is the person that they're going to go to ask those questions that they may think are stupid, that they may be hesitant to ask their direct leader. Also, it gives them an opportunity to talk to someone else that can say, hey, that makes sense. That was confusing for me when I started with the organization, but here's how you should think about it. There are studies that show that new hires that are connected with a peer buddy or a mentor, as soon as they start with the organization, they get their footing a lot quicker. They become more productive, and they also create a meaningful relationship that keeps them with the organization as they grow. And then last, equity, belonging, and accessibility. I talked a little bit about this in a previous slide. Ensure early experiences feel safe, inclusive, and they can navigate them. But it's also important to create a space where they can show up as their authentic self, right? So they don't feel like they have to pretend like they know everything. They don't have to pretend like maybe some of your communication that you're sharing with them is confusing. They don't have to pretend that it is really inclusive experience for them. And then I talked about this earlier. The time investment per new hire is 15 to 20 hours, strategically spread over 90 days. Um, you're not asking anyone to dedicate an entire week to onboarding. You're asking for intention and follow through spread out over the 90 days. So let's go into a couple of these in more detail. These are the next two that I'm going to cover are pre-boarding and weekly manager touch points because I think it's important to have clarity on what those look like. So pre-boarding, before they show up, is generally 1 to 2 weeks before the start date, whatever works for your organization. I don't know how long it takes you to recruit and once they say yes to when they start. But the thought is it's not the day before they start that you're starting the pre-boarding work. The relationship begins with the new hire the moment that they say yes. And oftentimes we forget that. Once they say yes, we're like, we fill the role, we can move on, and we don't think about them again until they start. And when they start, we have a pile of work that they have to do. But it's important to remember that this is the relationship that you're building. And it's the first signal as to who you are as an organization and whether or not the way you conduct your new hire orientation is aligned with your culture and your values. So here's how you should spend that time. It's generally an hour to an hour and a half. We talked about this. You'll send a welcome email. You'll send their agenda for the work first week. It also includes things like where do you park? What's the dress code? All of those housekeeping things. You should share their your mission, vision, and values grounding material. I also talked about this as a great opportunity to share your annual report with them as well. Any organizational charts you have, so they know how the organization is set up, will give them insight. And then prepare their workspace and technology. This is generally where most of the time is spent. Most of the hour to hour and a half is how do you get prepared internally about them coming? So making sure they have a workspace, make sure they have technology, and the technology is working, and it's going to be working on day one. I often see where new hires they have meetings to go to, or they have emails like during their orientation process. The leader references emails, yet they can't access their email for 2 to 3 days. Or they don't have their password. They have their computer, they don't have their password. So this is where the leader would spend some time to be intentional about getting that set up so it's working from day one. I also want to share a story about the workspace. So oftentimes Leaders will think, oh, we'll put them in the workspace that their predecessor was in. There's no prep there. We don't need to do anything. We already know where they're going to be sitting. I worked in one organization that had this thought process, and they hired a manager and they put them in the manager, the predecessor's office. And when the new hire opened the desk drawer, there was everything in there from like 2,000 paper clips to several pens that didn't work. It's all the little things, right? So the desk had not been cleaned out. They did not have the things that they needed, just simple things like pens, note papers, etc., notepads that they could use. So be intentional about setting up their space. And then we also talked about assigning their peer buddy. And then this is optional, but the organizations that do onboarding really well, they do this as well. The 15 minutes welcome call. This is where the leader, maybe the day before, a couple days before, the leader calls the new hire, just checks in with them and says, hey, we're looking forward to you starting the next couple days. Just want to reiterate that you're part of a very important organization and a mission. What questions do you have, etc. So the weekly manager touch points, this is another critical piece for onboarding. They're the bridge between what onboarding is and how leaders execute. So this time commitment around the weekly manager touch points, and they'll go to bi-weekly after the first month, is an hour and a half to 2 hours during the first month. So what does that look like? It's daily check-in meetings, just 10 to 15 minutes. This is if they're virtual, you can either call them or you can do a quick, if you have Slack, whatever your chat feature is, just check in with them, say, hey, how are you doing? Do you have any questions? What's been your aha moment? What's something that's not really clear? But let them know every day that you are thinking about them. And then from week 1 to 4 or their first month, there's weekly, they could be 45 to 60-minute one-on-ones. This is between the leader and the new hire, where you have uninterrupted time with the new hire and you talk about, okay, what have you learned so far? What are you seeing? What's unclear? What are some things that we can do better in regards to your onboarding process or your training process? But be intentional about that time. And then when you get into the second month to week 5 through week 8, then those weekly one-on-ones become bi-weekly, 30 to 45 minutes. They're starting to settle into their role, but you want to be intentional about spending time with them and making sure that you identify what's working well, where you can remove barriers, and then what additional tools that they may need. And then there is the 30, 60, 90-day milestone. You can incorporate the milestone meetings in with your check-in meetings, but there should be dedicated reflection and alignment conversations. So reflection is about how has your time been so far? Where is there ambiguity around our mission? Are there departments that you believe that you need to spend more time with to give you clarity around your role? This is also a time to be able to identify if there's any aha moments they have or any ideas they have to give you aha moments around where you could actually streamline processes or process improvements, things like that. So I'm going to pause there. I've covered a lot. I just want to make sure if there's any questions that I can answer, that we address those. Sabrina, do we have any questions so far?
No questions.
All right. That means everything's crystal clear. We'll see. So before and after intentional onboarding, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I think a lot of this is when we take time to think about it holistically, it's really common sense around it. So when you're not intentional and we about having a strategic onboarding process, the culture doesn't align. Their experience doesn't align with the culture. There's inconsistent expectations. New hires are unsure about where to go for help, or they may know about where to go for help, but they don't feel safe about going and asking the questions that they have. And ultimately, they're a little bit more slower to get their footing in the organization. But after intentional onboarding, there's the culture is reinforced consistently, expectations are clear. And when there's clear expectations, there's early wins as well for the new hire. There's stronger trust and mission alignment, and early relationships and support systems are in place, like the relationships with the leader, relationships with other departments, as well as with their buddy. And then ultimately, that leads to the new hire being able to contribute sooner, and it also attributes or is connected to their retention. Sorry about that. So, leaders create culture through small, consistent action, especially in the first 90 days. So let's pivot a little bit and talk a little more detail around culture and design. Um, so I don't know if you've heard the term design or culture drift. And this, in a nutshell, is when the organization says that their culture is one thing. They have their values listed. They say they value collaboration or they value work-life balance, etc. But their actions and behavior do not align. And so, some ways that culture drifts is, for example, with work-life balance. You say you have work-life balance as part of your culture, but everyone stays until 8 p.m. every night. They work through their lunches. They're expected to work on their weekends. Or you say you have collaboration, but every team operates in its own silo and barely talks to each other. Or maybe you say you promote equity and transparency, but all important decisions are made behind closed doors with the same three people. And so culture drift is never intentional or deliberate. Nobody's sitting around saying, let's say we value one thing and do another. It happens when culture isn't examined. It's what happens when we're all too busy running around, keeping things working, especially if we wear multiple hats in a non-for-profit. And then we just don't pause and take an opportunity to step back and see what's really happening regarding our culture. Are we actually living our values, or are we just saying them? On the flip side, culture design is different. Culture design means you name what you want to see reinforced. You identify the behaviors and practices that matter to you, and then you build them daily. So again, using the example of collaboration. If you say you're collaborative, new hires, as well as the rest of your employees, can see where collaboration is happening. Maybe there's a new grant that's been received, and there needs to be collaboration on how to spend those grant dollars. Or maybe one of the things that we really, really love in non-for-profits is how do we measure the success of how we spent those grant dollars? So, is there collaboration around how to do that? It also means that culture by design also means that you examine your meetings and how they're conducted. You examine whether or not everyone feels that they can contribute in those meetings. Or do you have new hires even after 90 days that are sitting back in the back of the room, not saying anything? Or there's employees that have been there for a while. They're sitting in the back of the room, not saying anything or not contributing. That can be an indicator that there's some cultural shift. The other thing around cultural design is, especially around non-for-profits, that you design your culture around capacity, meaning you don't say we value innovation and risk taking if your team is so underwater that they don't have the bandwidth to try anything new. And you don't say you value learning and development if they're so busy that they can't learn new things or there's no budget, even a small budget, for them to learn and develop. So, culture by design ultimately means that your aspirations match your reality. And here's why this matters. Your onboarding is where your culture gets proven or disproven. New people are watching everything. They're especially paying attention to whether what you said in the recruiting process is true or something else is happening. They're watching what gets reinforced, what gets ignored, and what gets rewarded. They're deciding in those first few weeks if they made the decision to sign on with the right place to support them, or if they made a bad decision to sign on with a place that doesn't support them. Ultimately, onboarding is your chance to prove that your culture is real. So, in terms of measuring what matters, I'm sure most of you have heard this, and I've used this a lot, that we measure what's important. So, how do you know if your onboarding is actually working? How do you know if your culture is healthy? You measure it. But you don't need expensive engagement surveys. Like I talked about the organization in the beginning in the story, they won the Gallup Exceptional Workplace Award. That organization over time invested in the Gallup engagement survey. You all don't need to do that. Most organizations don't need to invest in a fancy engagement system. But what you do need to do is be intentional and thoughtful about the process. So, in regards to onboarding success, the first 30 to 60 days, it's just simple questions you can ask the new hire. Do you feel connected to our mission? Do you know where to go for help? Again, these aren't formal surveys. This could be SurveyMonkey. It could be some other tool. It could even be an email where they just free form complete it, depending on the size of your organization. It could also be conversations that you have in those one-on-ones and those check-in meetings that I shared earlier. What's most important is that you sit down with them. Um, if you do a survey, that you sit down with them to discuss their responses. If you decide to do it in person, that it is uninterrupted time with them to show that you really want to hear what they're saying and you're actually listening. And then quarterly, you could do check-ins on culture health with your whole team. So not just your new hires. Ask questions like, what's keeping you here? When have you felt most value? Not what makes you leave, but what's keeping you here. That's a different answer. Being intentional about getting the entire team's input on the culture health. You can even ask them questions like, how often do you collaborate or work across departments? Because if they answer, we never do, that's an indicator that your cultural health needs to be evaluated. And then lastly, track completion and early integration. Did your new hires complete their orientation milestones? Are they contributing in meetings? Are they silently sitting back in those meetings even past the 90-day mark? Are they building relationships? Do you see them interacting with people? Are they still eating lunch alone? Um, those are all early indications of whether or not they've integrated into the organization. And then the last thing at the bottom is a tip around recognition. Recognition is powerful, even if you don't recognize. So, in relationship to recognition in general, the onboarding process should have opportunities for you to recognize the new hire. It could be the first time that they contribute in a meeting. It could be they've completed their 90-day milestone, or it could be anything that you create it to be. But what's most important is you build in some recognition for them. And that could be formal or informal. So I have another reflection for you. We covered a lot today. We talked about why onboarding matters, what it costs when it doesn't work, the framework for using it, so the 5 elements, and how to measure it. Now I want you to commit to something. Don't commit to me, commit to yourself or your organization. Here's the question. Drop in the chat. What's one thing you'll commit to doing differently in the next onboarding for your organization? Just one thing. If you're a high achiever, you could put 2 things, but the point is just one thing. It only takes one step forward to get started. So if you could drop those in the chat, maybe it's sending a welcome email before day one, so that pre-boarding process. Maybe it's creating an intentional 30 to 60, 90-day plan for the new hire. Or maybe it's assigning a peer buddy. Or maybe you have all of these elements already in place, and it could be just going back and doing a review to see if they align with your culture. Whatever it is, put it in chat. Let everyone see. Sabrina, if I could ask you just to, I know we're getting close to time.
Yes, someone said onboarding buddy is a great idea. We'll definitely do that. Mail a welcome card from our ED. Ensure our supervisory onboarding tool is consistently used across departments. Welcome email from CEO pre-boarding. I will talk with my CEO to develop a welcome email and meet weekly with new hire and check in frequently.
That's fantastic. So it sounds like all of you, or most of all of you, I can't see, have identified at least one thing to get moving forward. What I would ask is that you keep this commitment, write it down somewhere where it reminds you of your commitment, because we all know that after we end a webinar or roundtable, we get busy doing other things and we forget. But I would encourage you to write it down and remind yourself, and put it on your calendar. So we only have 5 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about the toolkit. So after this presentation later today, I have the emails of the participants. I plan to send some tools for you to use. So they're just practical resources. They're pretty much plug and play the help at your organization. If you already have these things in place, that's great. I would encourage you to share with other non-for-profit leaders, know other non-for-profit leaders that may not have these tools in place. So I would encourage you to share. So there'll be a 30, 60, 90-day template that you can customize for any role in your organization. There's an onboarding checklist is created in Excel. You can put it in Google Docs if that works for you. It's a comprehensive checklist that covers pre-boarding all the way through the 90 days. And then lastly, there's a cultural audit as well as AI prompts. So there's several questions that I've identified that you can ask your teams to be able to do a cultural audit to assess the health of your culture. And then included are AI prompts. So if you're a Chat GPT user or a Claude user or something else, there are some prompts that I've put in the document that you can pretty much copy and paste that help with the lift of building a strategic onboarding process. And with that, I will leave you with this thought. Culture isn't a project, it's a pattern, and onboarding is the first stitch in that pattern. So, how you build your relationship with your new hire from the day they say yes all the way through past their 90 days is how you start to align them with your culture and to live out your culture. And we only get one opportunity to do this because if you think about it, most of us remember our first day. Although sometimes when you get closer to that retirement age, you may not remember your first day. But in generally, we remember our first day at an organization. We remember our first week, our first month with the organization, especially if it wasn't a good experience or if it was a stellar experience. So my question to you is, how do you want people to feel when they join your mission? And then based on that answer, I would use that as your North Star to build a strategic onboarding plan for them. So let's stay connected. There's a QR code to my website. There's also my LinkedIn information here, as well as my email. I'm available as an ongoing resource for you. We can talk about culture, onboarding questions that you might have. If you just need a thought partner, etc., I'm available to you. And then also, I'm going to send you that email so you all will have my email. And I have 1 minute left for questions. My apologies that I didn't save more time for the end. But what questions do you have for me? Any questions, Sabrina?
No questions, but lots of thank yous. Very interesting information, great resources. Thank you for the toolkit. So lots of thank yous.
Well, I will answer everyone's thank you with deep gratitude and thank you for the hour that you spent talking about something that's really important for your employees and your organization. And thank you for allowing me to share my knowledge with you. With that, I hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thanks everyone for all
Take
this
care.
information. As a reminder, this is a second session of a series of human resources roundtable. The remaining hour-long sessions will take place in December and January 2026. The topics covered during this series include compensation and benefits on Thursday, December 18th, policies and practices Wednesday, January 14th, 2026. Following the presentation, you will receive a follow-up email with links to access the presentation materials and a survey link for you to leave any comments about the session. A special thank you to Kimala Daniels for sharing her HR wisdom, and thanks again for your time and all of your work. Take the best care and be well. Thank you.